Hi, everybody. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're located. Thank you for attending the CyberProof Talk, Security and Privacy Trends in the COVID-19 Era, hosted by CyberProof's CEO, Tony Velleca. Tony is joined by guest speaker, Enza Iannopollo, a senior analyst of security and risk at Forrester. Before we get started, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping items. First, if you're listening live and working remotely from home during this period, don't worry if there's a network connection issue. A recorded version of this conversation will be available using the same URL shortly after we're finished. If you're listening live and have any questions, you can type them at any time throughout the presentation. Please use the Ask a Question tab located below the player. Your question will be addressed during the Q&A session towards the end of the talk. There are also some additional resources for you to check out under the Attachments tab below the player. You can download these at any time. And finally, at the end of the talk, please take a moment to rate this conversation and provide any feedback using the Rate This tab below the player. Your feedback is really important to us. All right, take it away, Tony.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. So today, we're living in a very different world, and we thought this would be an excellent topic. There's probably more questions than there are answers today, but we wanted to get the opinion of the expert, Enza, on this topic. So prior to COVID-19, the conversation with many of our customers was there's such a tremendous focus around GDPR and other regulatory impacts. They were coming down heavy. They had huge penalties. I think a lot of people were standing at the edge of the pool to see when the enforcement would start on many of these regulatory items. But during the pandemic, many of the governments gave a moratorium or have simply not enforced a lot of the rules, and the conversation has changed. And we've had to do things like enable employees to work from home. We've had third parties that were, working on data that have to move their, maybe processing in the US with HIPAA or PCI type data, would be to, they had secure processing centers and they had to keep them in. So we had to move these people from home, and a lot of other challenges. So in the short term, we adapted, but the longer term, it may be more complex. But this really represents a huge shift in the priorities. And but at the same time, we're finding that the hackers are still out there and they're still attacking. I'll get to that in a second. One of the other trends that we're seeing is just because this is a pandemic with a life or death, it's a life or death situation, we're seeing large firms like, for example, Google and Apple are developing models to look at your proximity and do contact tracing as a result of Bluetooth and when you get close to somebody. These open up a lot of privacy issues. So is privacy still important? These are some brand new types of issues. How might this crisis or pandemic change our priorities when it comes to privacy after this? What will happen to these regulations that exist, and what new regulations will come? Will the current regulations even be enforced? And when? So these are some of the questions we'll ponder today and discuss. These are many of the things our customers are asking us and trying to refocus their priorities and figure out what this new normal would be. So today, we already introduced slightly, but Enza Iannopollo is a senior analyst of security and risk at Forrester. She contemplates all these different questions and has been speaking to many others about this. And the objective is to get her point of view on many of these topics. Obviously, we're making opinions about where some of this will go, but we figure that's better than having no information at all. And Enza's research focuses on the impact of internet regulations and data privacy issues on digital business models, as well as the technologies that underpin these. Her research covers data information protection, digital and electronic signatures, data risk and compliance, and privacy. So before we get started, I also wanted just to outline, is privacy, is security still important in this era of COVID and the pandemic? And unfortunately, it is. What we have found, and matter of fact, we'll share with you, there's a couple of pages out there, but if you look at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, you will see a great summary of the different types of attacks that are accelerating as a result of the COVID pandemic. Unfortunately, hackers are opportunistic. You're seeing an increase in phishing attacks using the subject coronavirus or COVID-19 as a lure. You're seeing malware distribution using coronavirus or COVID-19. You're seeing registrations of new domains with these topics, and you're seeing attacks against newly or often rapidly deployed people that are working out of their homes. So if you have split tunneling, you have your employee working at home, they have access to the internet, and then you have VPN or some means of getting into your corporate environment, you've just opened up access. So there's a number of different threat capabilities or vulnerabilities created by the change to working from home. So we'll explore some of that today. And if it weren't bad enough, you may have read about the hospital, Europe's largest private hospital system, Fresenius, if I say that correctly. It was impacted by the Snake ransomware, which took many of their systems down. As you may know, they are critical in the fight because they provide the dialysis machines in Europe, and kidney failure is one of the complications you get with COVID. So this is a fairly heartless type of attack, but these types of attacks are still happening, and we need to be vigilant with that. So anyway, seeing all that, I wanted to start maybe by asking a couple of questions to Enza, and then as we see audience participation and questions, we'll add those in. We'll keep it a little ad hoc today so that we can answer the questions that you're interested in. So let me start more generally. Enza, what do you see are some of the major trends in security risk and privacy today in Europe and the US as a result of COVID?
Tony, thank you, first of all, for having me today, and thank you for the question. Definitely, we keep seeing a lot of attention from our clients around cybersecurity attacks. Yesterday, I was talking to one client that actually is working on crisis management related to COVID specifically, but of course the team on the phone clearly said, you see, this is one crisis, one emergency that we have to tackle, and there are many risks related to it. But at the same time, we have our traditional, typical risks that we have to take care of. And definitely cybersecurity attacks, some of those that you have referenced are there and continue to be a trend. There are some differences that we started to see because of COVID, and we can go into some more details there, but typically we see still organizations very much worried about external attacks targeting their organization. In the latest figures that we saw, this is about 1/3 really of the overall attacks that organizations suffer. And also still trend around internal incidents as being some of the source of this attack, at the same time as third parties. Now, work from home, the fact that not only your employees are working from home, but also third parties' employees are working from home, this, of course, might even change the level of prioritization and concern around these specific trends. So I would say that these are the area, and still probably the priorities are still there, very much looking at these external attacks as the really main threat, and then without forgetting that internal incidents as well as third parties generated attacks are there and probably will increase in volume as we move forward. if we look a little bit into more detail around the external attacks that we are seeing, there is already an interesting change. When we asked this question before this COVID-19 emergency, things like social engineering, for example, was low in the list. People didn't think that that was to be that was one of the sources of external attack, the way the external attack was carried out most typical. Now we are starting to see that social engineering kind of attack starting to become much more likely than were in the past. But if we look generally, and this is true between the US and Europe, I don't see a lot of differences in the sort of again, priorities there and the numbers in terms of how these external attacks are really carried out. Software vulnerability continue to be the #1 ways in which these attacks are carried out, as well as web applications. Web application has been one of the really targets of these attack. These sorts of attacks, and this is one. And I talked recently to one of my colleagues at Forrester, Sandy Carielli. She covers specifically the application security space, and of course, she was looking at what was going on, thinking this is not the moment really to try and reduce the efforts around that specific area, the application security. And there is something that really has to happen in terms of the mindset, the testing, the security, and also privacy-related testing happen too late into the development process. Typically happen when everything is done, and then it's very difficult to go and fix things that are already done. So really pushing that security testing and everything that relates to risk and privacy testing up in the process may play a very important difference there. And another element that actually came up out of that conversation was the fact that developers aren't stopping. Their ability to release software is faster and faster, and the same should be for security tools and processes, and try to cope with those vulnerability. And in our conversation also around which are the kind of attacks that we see, phishing, and you already, Tony, mentioned that it's something that was already present in the list before COVID, is becoming one of the central points of conversation today. The classical example there, or the most frequent example that we find even now, is really the compromise that happens through business email. So someone that you receive an email, and then especially in this working from home environment where everyone feels a little bit isolated, you receive an email, it looks like exactly as one of the emails that comes within your organization, very often impersonating someone in the executive team or someone else in the company, typically with authority. And of course, it's prompting the user to do things that it shouldn't. And but this sentiment of working from home and isolation clearly is also accelerating the not only the frequency, is creating an opportunity for attackers, but also creates the sentiment in employees that, of course, I need to go and check if someone in my organization, if an executive is sending me an email. And I make the point of phishing because, you know, has been there for a very long time, but this is together with that social engineering piece. Phishing is one of the big vector now within this COVID-19 emergency. Again, not a lot of difference between Europe and the US. We tend to see these elements together. In Europe, seem to be also the discussion around DDoS attack, one that tend to happen maybe more frequently than in the US, but in terms of some of the source of attack, and if in the case of external attacks, how these are carried out, those attacker strategies seem to be very, very similar across these two regions.
So that's great input. By the way, just to add in, somebody asked a question that they couldn't see the slides. Today we decided to make this conversational and not use slides, but you'll have a recording of the conversation from this today. So Enza, as you said, there's a lot of increase attacks on the attack front. Many of them are similar ways of attacks, phishing attacks that we've seen before, but in the name of COVID and other areas. A lot of our focus before the pandemic was on making sure that as companies own more and more user data, there were we enabled right to be forgotten, and we gave consumers right to certain amounts of data. How do you see the COVID-19 pandemic and these attacks? How do you see it potentially changing some of these trends or impacting this, the work?
There is one point that I always start from to describe what might happen to the world of security and privacy during this crisis and beyond that. And it's really looking at the behavior of people, consumers. We have recently completed a survey around sentiment and behavior of consumers around the world in this moment of emergency. And we also try to understand what are their expectations, as far as you can predict clearly, but how are the expectations, which are the expectations of consumers after this crisis. It's clear, and probably many on the phone today said, well, we knew that digital. Consumers are using a lot of digital. What's the difference? That when you see the data, when you see that clear trend delineating itself with data and being true across geographies, then it really starts to be not just a perception, but really starts to be an element that you can use really to think about how do I build my privacy, security, business strategy really for the time beyond this crisis. And so the behavior is very clear. We have a number of consumers that are spending more time online than ever before, and the number is 70% in Europe and in the US. Is the number 70% refers to Europe in particular. 70% of European consumers saying we are spending much more time online than we have ever done before. And this means that they are also buying things online. Now, you might think, well, this is what we expected. But the interesting part there was that there are consumers that for the very first time decided to embrace online activity, buying, but also paying bills online, banking online, using digital payment methods online. So it's not just buying groceries or maybe using, I don't know, opening up a subscription for streaming music or streaming movies. Though there are also things that really create, from a security and privacy perspective, and broader questions around more and more consumers are going to open up a bank account online. More and more are going to bank online. More and more are going to use payments services online. Of course, you can imagine that everything that relates to the identity protection, the possibility for a fraud, there is clearly one of the risks that we are tracking very closely. But also, we say, okay, how much of these, how many of these habits, digital habits that consumers are clearly having now, is going to survive? And also, there was interesting to see, in average, 30% of consumers worldwide are saying, even after COVID, we are going to spend much more money online than we did before. They are asking for more opportunity to do buy online and collect in the shop. And so this is really describing a profound change in the way consumers behave. It's also interesting that many of these consumers are also clearly employees that are embracing now work from home, and also the push on using digital products and services more than they did in the past in their work environment. So clearly we are seeing a push on all these digital habits. And then the question is, how do we make sure as businesses that we can respond and adapt to provide the level of experiences that these consumers are expecting from businesses to happen now digitally, but also how do we protect? Because all this digital activity means that data assets are just going through the roof as never happened before. And you may have businesses and firms that in the past had a smaller digital footprint. Then very quickly now we need to increase that. We need to protect that data. We need to provide all the security that is needed. So it's a lot of change for organization, and definitely this idea of COVID and digital habits developing and staying with us for the future, it's something that we clearly see, and our data is really suggesting that's the way forward.
No, that's very interesting, particularly the idea that additional consumers are open to using digital services. So, you know, digital transformation was already a trend, but many of the public and private relationships were in some ways slowing that down. You know, the consumers were wanting more rights into their data. That may not change, but the fact that if anything, governments were slowing that down somewhat by putting a lot of regulation around this. Do you see there might be more a change in the way the public and private sectors collaborate as a result of the pandemic and the new threats?
It's difficult to predict. Of course, as I have described, this aspect of consumers engaging with digital and making decision about how much I want to share in terms of my data, making decision about with whom I want to share. We know that trust plays a very important role when you decide to share more data with an organization. But then there is the other aspect of all of this, which is some of the data that is collected by governments, by companies, because of health and safety in this moment. So clearly the relationship and the sensitivity around some of the discussion of protecting sensitive data, collecting sensitive data, sharing that data is, is very current, and also, again, is sensitive as a conversation. I think, and also we have seen in other areas, health and safety related, more data sharing happening between private and public organization. And I think that COVID showed us how it's difficult to make decisions where you cannot rely on data, because it was difficult really to collect and compare this data. So there were a number of efforts between private and public organizations in Europe and the US to really build a database and really try and collaborate on more data sharing to get a picture of what was going on, so that we could act to take care of the health and safety of everyone. So it's clear that even in the area of security, there is something that should happen more, that has enormous benefits and can be beneficial to everyone. But in the same way, as we have been saying, look, even these data sharing that happens right now between private and public organization has to happen with some safeguards, has to happen with specific limitation in terms of scope, with specific protection in terms of the identifiable pieces of that information, has to happen with a specific control about who actually has access to that, how they're going to use that information, until when they're going to use that information. I believe that similarly, when we talk about security-specific discussion, more data sharing is beneficial, but it has to happen within agreed-upon set of safeguards. Now, regulation over time has tried to provide that, to really incentivize companies and governments to collaborate together to improve cybersecurity posture. I don't think that those experiences have been particularly successful. I don't think that any of those regulations have achieved exactly what they wanted to achieve. So I think it should be more an effort that regulators can, in the specific, element of coming together for sharing data for better results in the security arena. I think governments can only do so far. But I don't know, they might try to again create more incentives to companies to come together with governments for more data sharing, but again, it's a complex issue.
Yeah, and it's obviously a very interesting topic, and we'll probably, as you say, probably have to see how it evolves. During the pandemic, I know a lot of the enforcement of regulations, particularly around privacy, has been relaxed so that businesses could operate and the economy could keep going. But we're also seeing some really interesting trends. For example, Google and Apple are innovating new ways together to use Bluetooth for contact tracing. But this opens up a lot of very new and interesting privacy issues. Knowing exactly who you've been near at any, all points of your day could obviously open up some very interesting topics. So what do you see the impact on some of these emergency powers being, and some of the innovation that's happening between this is an example of commercial companies, but this is potentially in collaboration with governments?
Definitely one of the, at the moment, one of the most common questions that I hear from clients relate exactly to this. There are a few things that I would like to go through as I respond to it. The first is that geographies have treated emergency powers differently. Clearly, everywhere, the priority today is to make sure that citizen employees are protected. So health and safety is, regardless of the geography, that remains really the priority for governments, for companies. But the way, from a privacy perspective and under data collection perspective, we have been enabling that to happen is different. And I tend to make this point because to me is a fundamental difference that exists between different geographies. So in Europe, there is the General Data Protection Regulation, there is the GDPR, that as a mechanism built in it, then clearly allows for some of the requirements to be used in a certain way in case there is an emergency and a safety situation like this one. What I mean is, for example, some of the requirements around legal basis, the consent that you need from your consumers to do certain things, the consent that you need from employees to do certain things, those are relaxed because in this moment is the emergency, the health and safety the priority. And therefore, the data protection authorities Europe have been saying, look, the rules are still in place. The GDPR is still in place. We are looking at that a room that the GDPR offers employer and governments to really, in this moment, to have access to the data that they need. But it's very clear. First, this is an emergency situation. If you are doing emergency and health and safety as your legal basis to do all of this collection and sharing, is very clear that in the moment the emergency goes away, you don't have a legal basis anymore. And if you, as an employer, for example, are using technology now that says, well, this is for health and safety, make sure that all the policies that relate to data deletion, data sharing with third parties, who has access to that data, and all the security around it is really built to support the specific health and safety legal basis that you are using. In other geographies, instead, there was a real relaxation of the rules. So there is not the rules being in place as they originally are, but there were a number of gaps that were created so that more flexibility could be introduced. Why this is very different? Because if we are sticking to a certain set of rules like the GDPR, regulators have the power to enforce the rules whenever they want. And even within this emergency situation, they might say, well, there is someone that is actually abusing this flexibility that GDPR offers. And so the enforcement can happen at any time, and companies are accountable to those rules even at the moment of an emergency. And in fact, still, if you look at the website, or if you look at a website that track enforcement action, we are still, the data protection authorities are still working. There is not a real pause on that. Certainly, the numbers have been slowing down. I mean, the frequency of some actions has been slowing down clearly because this new way of this emergency has impacted everyone clearly. But the enforcement is still going on. In geographies where we said, we create some gaps so that we allow certain things to happen, we have to remain very vigilant because we will need government to go and fill those gaps when the emergency is over, so that then the law enforcement can happen. So those are differences that can play out in the longer term. Those are situations that are different. Now, the contact tracing activity technology that is out there to actually understand where we are in a certain time, so that we can actually identify if there are new outbreak of the infection. There are a number of different approaches. In Europe, we have been pushing, or the authorities have been pushing for a decentralized architecture in those apps. Other geographies, other companies, private companies have decided instead that they want to go for a more centralized architecture of those applications. Either way, from a privacy perspective, you need to remain vigilant. And I think the idea, as I said, if you are an employer looking at using some of this technology within your premises or outside your premises to really protect your employees, make sure that you are creating the right policies and the safeguards in place to avoid any abuse of that data, meaning have clear deletion policies, have a clear communication about who actually is seeing that data, and make sure that if it's someone in the HR that is overseeing that data, if it's someone in your health and safety team, make sure that those people are trained to know which specific risks they are handling. Is extremely important to make ourselves accountable, because health and safety is an extreme priority, but privacy and security don't go away. My personal advice is, today my feel that we are entitled to say we don't care about privacy now and security now. This is not the time to care about these things, because there are lives to save. And I completely agree. But if you, as an employer, as a business, decide to disregard all the privacy and security safeguards now, you will be left with an enormous legacy of problem, because once the emergency is gone, that data will be still there and you will be liable for it, and you will need to make yourself accountable for it. So as you approach these initiatives, because of health and safety, that I repeat is the priority, make sure that also you are taking all the right steps to make sure that you don't find yourself in breach of the rules, that you don't find yourself in breach of your employees' and consumers' trust, and also that you don't find yourself in the hands of attackers that are very opportunistic and are just out there waiting for that opportunity to present themselves.
So great. I have an audience question here. So it's more around technology used, but I'll go ahead and read it and see if we can address it in line to this. How much will AI and automation help in solving the privacy compliance problems? Do you recommend any specific areas where development firms can invest in or help solve privacy problems that will be faced by organizations in finance, healthcare, and retail?
Artificial intelligence and anonymization was the other piece?
Automation.
Automation. So I will respond that technology can definitely be helpful. I have seen in the specific area of privacy management more and more use of artificial intelligence and automation to really solve some of the challenges that clearly companies have. One thing that I would say in an area where specifically I think that can be very helpful to use this technology, I think one area is around discovery and classification of data, where I think automation, artificial intelligence can play a very important role, especially if you think that digital is going to expand substantially the perimeter. So your data, first of all, is changing the idea of data itself. It's not just structure and structure. It might be a picture, it might be an audio, it might be a complete different kind of type that we have been traditionally dealing with. So digital means also understanding there are a proliferation of different data types that we didn't deal with in the past. And I think that technology can help to identify where that data lives, really in a broad way. So an area of interesting development, I think, is that one. Another one that comes to privacy specifically is around automation of data subject request. Because there is so much data coming into organization, clearly the possibility for your consumers, your employees, your third parties to come back and say, hey, which data do you have about me? Hey, I would like you to delete that data about me. means that organizations have to act very quickly when it comes to the identification of the data that belongs to that specific person, and then go ahead and do whatever deletion or portability requests they need to comply with. So that's another area where I think technology can really help solve some of the specific challenges. But I would say this, that privacy and I think security are not challenges that you are going to solve with a pure technology solution, purely with a technology solution. Those are challenges that will need technology, will need processes, will need oversight, and will need continuous training, especially of your employees, to make sure that you as an organization are challenging that. So technology can really help. And I just gave an example of 2 areas, but there is plenty. And actually, when we ask, in one of our surveys, which areas do you think, that was the question, and which specific area do you think that automation will deliver most value? Security was the number 2 in the list. So clearly there is plenty of use cases there, and we are already seeing that. But technology alone is not going to solve the whole challenge. It requires more than that. It requires, again, people oversight and the process angle of these.
It's interesting too. I just yesterday heard a piece on the news where they had talked about companies using spyware to make sure employees working from home were productive. And obviously that's a use of technology, probably not AI, but to start solving some of these problems from one standpoint. But do you see this creating more, a government's going to have to now create more laws and regulations, because as people innovate to, solve some of the problems that are created by the crisis, they're now creeping into people's homes with things like spyware, and potentially, in some cases, I've even heard of firms using more of a BYOD approach. We were limited in terms of devices people could work on, so they had to get creative there. So how do you see this creating some response in terms of new regulations around privacy?
There is a trend around privacy regulation that I think was precedent to COVID. And I kept saying GDPR was just the first one, because privacy regulation has clearly become today a global trend. We have seen California with the CCPA, and again now with a potential CCPA 2.0. We have seen Brazil passing regulation for privacy. We have seen Japan making changes, Nigeria. We are expecting India to adopt a new privacy regulation, and maybe at some point next year also the European Parliament again to move and formalize the e-privacy regulation. It's a directive today, but it's going to be a regulation once the process is over. So the privacy regulation as a global trend is something that we have been watching since GDPR came along, that generated a number of other regulations and stimulated the production of privacy regulation, also educated consumers on their rights. And we clearly see that they are picking up on those. So this is definitely something that that is happening. In terms of, is the government going to produce more regulation to respond to some of the challenges of working from home environment, for example, for COVID? That I don't know, because one of the issues of regulators is that they tend always to play catch up with technology. And when they arrive, sometimes it's difficult to change business practices, difficult to change employees' habits. And so that may happen, but I don't think that will be quick enough to produce the changes that we need right now. It's also true that in the conversations with a number of organizations, they are all saying working from home is not only an emergency measure for us. Actually, we are thinking to really introduce more flexibility in our workforce on a long-term basis. So I have heard of companies that are now introducing a goal of, for example, 20% of their workforce to work from home on a normal basis. Someone said more than 50%, and yesterday I think Twitter said that maybe they want 100% of their employee population to work from home or in any way more flexible ways. So if then we are really looking at, and we will at some point, really looking at work environments that have become hybrid, where there is much more flexibility than it is today, I think that might have that there will be a place for government regulation to solve specific issues. What I see today, when I keep saying to my customers, with my clients, when you see something that you need to solve right now, try to act in a responsible and ethical manner. For example, someone that is trying to do performance monitoring of their employees, insider threat programs, and some sort of location tracking all in the same place, all in the same way. Those are approaches that I don't think will deliver a lot of value, because create a lot of confusion in your employees at this moment. If you want to develop a program that is around the old insider threat program, you want to monitor because you are thinking that people might be developing behavior that might be threatening to your organization. Have the conversation that you need to have. If you're in Europe, probably you will need to engage with work councils and data protection officers. Have the conversation, build a case for it, demonstrate that really that may pose a new special threat to your security posture, and trying to roll out those programs in a way that take into account the culture of the organization, the authorities that you have with you, again, work council if you're in Europe, data protection officers, and then be very transparent with your employees. Make sure that they understand what you are deploying and why, and help them improve their behaviors, because there might be someone that is trying to do something wrong, but sometimes, most time, there are people that behave in the wrong way simply because these are new conditions for them. Not everyone is used to work from home. Not everyone has the right technology and equipment. So be transparent. Don't wait for government to tell you what to do. Take decision today that can make your organization more secure, but at the same time, don't undermine the trust of your employees. And transparency is one of the main ideas there. And also work with the other parties that you have with you. Privacy, work council if you have to work with them, and whoever is there then can help you take the right decisions right now. Being transparent. This is the most important thing for me right now.
So it's interesting, as you noted, what most people are predicting is this will drive a new normal, and it happened overnight. So one of the unique trends about working from home is that before you have digital happening where people are moving a lot of things out of their data centers into the cloud. Now you have workers working from home. So the whole idea of having a network and security inside your premises is a question. So which is driving many more questions. But fundamentally, do you think this is a good time to make wholesale rethinking of security strategies and security and privacy strategies? What was it Churchill?
Yes.
He said, never waste a good crisis, right?
Yeah,
so.
It is. And I, for a number of reasons, but I have said, let's start from looking at employee and consumers' behavior. Companies will need to respond from a consumer's angle. Again, there will be much more data to handle, and don't think that consumers are just thinking, I want to use all digital, so here are all my data, do what you want with it, because data is actually telling us that this is not the case. Consumers are not all the same, but definitely they are much more aware of their privacy rights. We have numbers suggesting that in Europe, where there are access and portability and right to be forgotten, 1/3 of the consumer population has used that already. And clearly, when there is a crisis, those behaviors tend to happen more and more, because, of course, I want to know what is going on with my data if something with that company is going wrong. So there is that aspect of privacy. From a security perspective, I think organizations are dealing with a number of challenges. We knew from our numbers, from our data before COVID, that typically organizations felt unprepared to really tackle the cybersecurity threats, and they felt that they were not winning that battle. I think that this feeling is staying with the organization, is probably become more prevalent because again, we are seeing a number of attacks becoming more frequent, a number of opportunity for attackers being made available. We talk about the social engineering, we talk about phishing, fraud, the potential for identity fraud, and anything that pertain with consumers using more online behavior. Workers at home means
We may have lost Enza here for a second. Let's give her a chance to reconnect. While we're waiting for that, please go ahead and submit any additional questions you might have. Hopefully she'll rejoin here. If not, we'll take the audio for where we have one or two more questions to cover. But as we're waiting to, the next question will be, the other challenge we've heard from our customers is around third parties. So as many of our many companies were able to get their employees up and working remotely. However, we've seen many challenges in the space of third parties, particularly third parties that were doing large data center large operations, data, maybe HIPAA or PCI type operations. And the challenge there is the way we have architected many of those solutions is we had requirements for physical security as well as the complete control over the network, the auditing, cameras, everything to make sure that the data was protected. As companies shifted those operations into remote work scenarios, the physical security requirements and some of the just control over the network and the visibility were very hard to see. So it created, this was a major challenge we saw in the short term. And as we know, the new normal might be that some of these employees or some of these situations persist. So we may see those. Okay.
Tony, I am back.
Okay, go ahead. We couldn't hear you. So
yes, there was of course, a connection issue. So my apologies. I was just saying. We were discussing the change of strategy for security strategy, and where I was going with that is really the idea that there will be changes, but not necessarily means that everything that you do as an organization has to be brand new. I mean, this is not the time where organization will go out and do a lot of buying of new stuff. Actually, we expect security budgets to be cut, things that didn't happen necessarily in the past. So what we do expect to see is, well, first of all, really organization looking at their strategy. We know the cybersecurity strategies haven't been where they needed to be. And there was a lot of gap between my cybersecurity strategy being a top priority and actually how confident I am as a CISO about my cybersecurity strategy. we need to get clear on which are the priorities, how do we solve them, and a lot of it will be securing the new normal. We do things that the use of services will be more. We have already seen that services was one of the way CISOs are going about their security strategy. I think the service providers that will be used will need also to provide clear KPIs when it comes to their value, the value that they provide to the organization, to the impact that they can have in terms of the value that they can generate. And then I think companies will need to tackle the shortage of staff. This has been a discussion that we have been having for a long time in security. And I think this is really the time to tackle that. Maybe not immediately, because again, there will be some shrinking of resources here. But once companies are looking back at hiring, I really hope that the industry will look at diversifying their teams and really being more open and inclusive. And I think that might, so if we really change the mindset around hiring for security, and we become more inclusive of women in our teams, that we become we make a goal of creating diverse teams, I believe that may help with that staff shortage and shortage of skills in general. So those three things, we need to rethink our strategy and make sure that we are confident with our strategy and we focus on the new priority of the new normal. The trend of working with outsourcing some of the tasks, working with service providers will remain and will increase. But those service providers will need to be kept really accountable with clear KPI for the value that they deliver. And then we'll need to tackle the skill shortage once and for all, really creating more inclusion and diversity in this industry.
Yeah, that's a really good point. As a matter of fact, I think next week I'm presenting at the WISIS conference on this. I always like to think of the opportunities that are creating. One of the things that we've done as a company is we've trained veterans in cyber security operations, and expanding that training to women in the industry, and particularly now that work from home is more prevalent, being able to do some of those jobs from working homes and looking for helping single moms and things like that in those industries are creative ways that maybe this whole pandemic will open up mindsets on how we can expand roles within security. So very good points. I think we've covered most of the key questions that I had on my list, and I don't see any additional audience questions. Would you like to conclude with anything, or should I just wrap for you?
No, well, for my side, again, thank you for having me on this podcast today. The recommendation for everyone, as their organizations go back to work and they think about more digital initiatives, more automation, and more disrupting technology to bring in, enable the business to do that with the right safeguards from a security and a privacy perspective, and trying to build those as the business moves. Don't wait for everything to happen to think about, but maybe we need to check for security, or there is a privacy problem there. Make sure that you are embedded as security professional and privacy professional in those projects now, so that you can enable the business really to innovate, to be ready for the new normal, having security and privacy at its core.
That's fantastic. And as everyone can see, the COVID-19 pandemic has had and will have a tremendous impact on security and data privacy. And frankly, there will be some very fast and comprehensive changes as a result. This will likely drive a more urgent need for data protection and potentially generate more sensitive data. So there are many unknowns left. And I'm sure most of the people on this call are right in the crosshairs of how cybersecurity and data privacy will be impacted in this new normal. So anyway, hopefully this session today brought up some of these topics, got your mind thinking about these, but we really appreciate your attendance. And if you have any follow-up questions, I think we can, Deborah, I think they can access the recording and potentially ask those questions through the platform, correct?
If not, they can also visit our website, which they'll be able to find the information from the recording and ask the question there, and we'll get you in touch either with Tony or with Enza.
Right. And thanks, Enza, again for your time. I really appreciate your point of view and your knowledge and depth on these topics.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.